Yes, Syria has been in the news for some considerable time. I think we almost become immune to it on occasions. And yet, the statistics are terrifying. I looked at some recently. In the 5 years of this conflict, I'll probably be corrected slightly, but approximately, and apparently these are conservative estimates, 250,000 Syrians, that's 250,000 people, have been killed, and 1 million more seriously injured. Some 11 million have been forced from their homes. The total population of Syria, what keeps changing clearly in this situation, but the total population is 23 million, so that's at least half, but more or less half the population has been forced out of their homes, and a good number of those destroyed. And there's about 4 million people who've fled abroad as refugees, often making very hazardous, dangerous and sometimes fatal attempts at escape. So the topic is well worth our consideration and our support, and we're very grateful to our speakers and to you all for coming. So we're going to begin with the main speaker, Dr Leila Vignal. She'll be followed by some short reflections by Timothy Radcliffe, and then there'll be an opportunity for talk and discussion.
This talk is about the human cost of the Syrian crisis, because as I remembered just now by Andrew, the level of suffering experienced by the Syrian population is indeed of an enormous magnitude. The impact of this conflict is also felt to a lesser extent by the population of the surrounding countries of Syria, because the huge majority of Syrian refugees has taken shelter in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and to a lesser extent to Egypt and to some provinces of northern Iraq. The Syrian conflict is now also, as we all know, a European issue. And so it's upon those three aspects: the situation of the population inside Syria, the situation of the Syrian refugees in the region, in the Middle East, and the European dimension of the Syrian crisis that I would like to touch upon briefly this morning. So first, a brief background on the Syrian conflict. So as you well know, 5 years ago now, nearly to the day, in March 2011, following Tunisia and Egypt, a movement of protest took the streets of Syria and developed through the months. So it was a pacific movement asking, as in Tunisia and Egypt, for rights, dignity. And so this movement was immediately met by a harsh repression, firing on demonstrators, encirclement of cities, shelling of the neighborhoods where those demonstrations would take place, large campaign of arrests. So it has been, since the beginning, a story of repression. And the pacific movement of demonstration continued to develop throughout 2011 and 2012. As you could see here, this is a graph that shows you the demonstrations on Fridays, because it's on Fridays the demonstration took place. So it's a snapshot on different days, and you can see that throughout 2012 the movement faded because the uprisings, then this democratic and popular uprising, then gave way to military confrontation. So it's a map that shows you, the geographic repartition of the demonstrations. Most of Syria is uninhabited, so this is why it's mostly in the cities of the western coast and in the Euphrates Valley. So, the uprising mutated into an armed confrontation between the regime and many different opposition armed groups. And the country has been divided in many different areas. So this is the latest map, showing the different position of the different main groups. But of course, the situation has evolved over the years. And so, as you know, so confrontation between the regime and different armed groups. Some of them are in coalition, some of them are just local groups. And from the summer 2014 onwards, the so-called Islamic group, Islamic State group, expanded from Iraq in the eastern areas of the country, where it fought mainly opposition groups. There has been nearly no confrontation with the regime forces. And so it expanded throughout the Euphrates Valley. It's black colored areas. So the conflict is also complicated by the involvement of external actors that are supporting from afar some opposition groups and coalitions, providing funding and light armaments, and for the opposition groups, and the regime forces benefit from the support of Iran and Russia, mostly, who are providing arms and also ground troops. And as you know, since last autumn, Russia has also involved its aerial power at the side of the regime forces. And so we are. It's a conflict that is very much unbalanced between the military power of the regime and its allies. And it has to be mentioned that the regime is the only one that has an aerial power. You know, it has all the aviation of the regime. Now, of course, there is a United States-led coalition that is also bombing the ISIS areas, but that does not bomb the regime-held areas. But it's important to be reminded that this aerial power of the regime and its proxies and now of Russia is key to understand the sheer scale of destruction and displacement in Syria, because the bombing campaigns are, I'm going to get into this, destroying part of the urban fabric and targeting the civilian population in Syria. So one aspect that has been touched upon by Andrew is the human toll of Syria. So the deaths are between 250, 270,000, 100,000 people, including tens of thousands of children. This is a conservative estimate, but this is, the lower threshold of the estimations that we have for the moment. So the wounded person, it's possibly 4 times more this number, so about 1 million, as Andrew said. Lots of disappearances, more than 60,000 that are documented, and a generalized use of torture, mainly into the prisons of the regimes, but also acts of tortures and unlawful killing have been also perpetrated by opposition armed groups, of course, especially in the ISIS-held areas. So the consequences of the violence on the population is also to be seen in the destruction of the urban fabric. Large areas of the country are torn down, destroyed, or not functional anymore. So destruction affects entire cities or entire neighborhoods of the big cities of Syria, like the eastern side of Aleppo. So this is an aerial image of Aleppo, and you can see there is a gradation of colors that shows you in red the buildings that are destroyed, and in yellow all the areas that are severely damaged. So you can see the eastern side part of Aleppo that is held by the opposition groups since the summer 2012, and that is currently being a bit crushed down, but this is another story, are heavily destroyed, as you can see, and the regime-held areas are intact. So you've got here pictures, you've probably seen those pictures in the news. So this is Al-Qusair, a city that has been that is in the southeast of Homs, that has been retaken by the regime forces in the spring 2013, and using scorched earth tactics, bombing, aerial bombing, and then when the city is destroyed and the opposition group have been forced out, the military, the regime forces retake the city. So it's completely flat down. This is a picture of one of the neighborhood of homes. And most of the destruction, especially in Aleppo, but in other cities, are inflicted by bombing, aerial bombing, and also the throwing of barrel bombs over civilian areas from helicopters. And these are devices that are extremely deadly and who also causes massive destruction in the physical environment. So, so you know, some figures of the destruction of the urban fabric of Syria. Nearly 3 million buildings were considered to have been either damaged or destroyed in 2013. Now I don't have the recent estimates, but I'm looking for them. But it's of course much more worse. It's the residential buildings that are also bearing the brunt of these destructions, which means that people are really put out of their houses. The public infrastructure and all the service infrastructure are very much targeted and impacted, like the hospitals, the health centers, the schools. Just 1 in 4 schools is considered to be one school in 4 is considered to be not functional or destroyed. Bakeries, mosques, churches, commercial zones, industrial zones, factories have been also deeply affected by destruction. So the economic losses are enormous, $200 billion as here again a conservative estimate. And now the country has really turned into an economy of war. The former economy does not exist anymore due to all this destruction and the conflict situation. So the magnitude of the violence of the Syrian conflict has also, of course, consequences on the population. So it was 21 million Syrians in 2011. So as Andrew reminded us, there are 5 million refugees that are outside Syria. The equivalent for UK would be 20 million British citizens outside the UK. 6.5 internally displaced people who have had to flee but who have remained within the border of the state. So it's 1/3 of the pre-2011 population. It would be 16 million if you do the equivalent for the UK. So a total of 11.5 million people who have had to flee their homes. It's 55% of the pre-2011 population, and it would be 36 million if you make the equivalence with UK today. So this displacement is also extremely intensive. You know, it took place within 5 years, 4 or 5 years, because displacement really started to a bigger scale from 2012 with the bombings. So massive displacement within a short range of time. In 2015 alone, more than 1.5 million persons were displaced due to the conflict. So it's massive and very intense. So in Syria, there is a lot of variability from one area to another regarding displacement of people. And this variability is, of course, not surprisingly dependent of the level of violence. The IDPs that are questioned report that they flee their home and they get into this displacement trajectory due to the indiscriminate attacks and use of explosive weapons in populated areas. They flee the deliberate targeting of civilians and civilians' objects through the bombings, and they are fleeing situation of siege. As you know, there are nearly 400,000 people who are trapped in siege, in besieged areas in Syria currently. There is a huge diversity of displacement patterns. Most of the time, displacement is part of a continuum. People do not immediately seek shelter outside, cross-border, outside of the country. They go first where they have family, where they have friends, where they have personal networks who can provide them with a roof, with support, etc., with a living. And so generally the first displacement takes place nearby in the neighborhood. And so people move to get away from fighting, they seek temporary shelter, and from a first temporary shelter they make assessments as to whether return is safe or if it's not. And so displacement can be a temporary situation, going back and forth with to the place where they come from. But however, the protracted nature of the Syrian conflict and the fact that violence is not limited to military front lines but expands to civilian neighborhoods means that those assessments that people make are multiple. They are likely to be renewed at different occasions by the individuals or the families that are on the move. And families that have crossed the borders, that are refugees outside Syria, have generally a history of 8 internal displacements before crossing the border. So this leads to the transformation of the patterns of the population. Some places are emptied, some places have seen their population doubling, like the ones that are in the darker shades of purple. So it's a map in French, but so you see the big spots are showing the importance of the displaced population in Syria. In Hama, for instance, which is a city here under the control of the regime, the population of displaced people is probably of 300,000 inhabitants, so it's a third of the previous city's population. So you see it's really massive. It has a massive impact on the population patterns. And some other areas have witnessed brutal losses of population. There are reports that in some villages there is less than 25% of the previous population, or some areas are completely emptied. So just the example of East Aleppo, we are talking a lot of East Aleppo. East Aleppo has been the eastern areas of Aleppo have been the target of huge bombing on the civilian areas. So these are the impacts of one of the campaigns of bombing in 2013, beginning of 2014. So you can see the different shades of destruction, ranging from lighter destruction to more destruction in red. And you can see in the populations of 4 neighborhoods that have been researched, nearly all the population has fled, between around 80% of the population has fled. So it's a massive movement of population here again. So the people in Syria, there is the issue of the displaced person, but more generally, the whole Syrian population, even the population that has not been displaced, is in need of everything, in need of humanitarian assistance. So this is a map of the number of people in need as reported by one of the organizations of the United Nations that looks after Syria. It's estimated that on the current population, which is 16 million, because 5 million are outside, there is 13.5 million people who are in need of humanitarian assistance, so it's more than 80% of the population. It would be 55 million for the UK. It's estimated that 2 million children are out of school, 3 in 5 locations are affected by child labor, 3 in 4 persons live in poverty. The life expectancy has dropped down of 20 years compared to pre-2011 levels. 1 in 3 persons are unable to meet their basic food needs, and we can keep on the list, a terrible list going on. Up, I'm just. I thought I had another slide. Okay. A very dire situation inside Syria. So people, as you know, 5 million of Syrians have taken shelter outside, mostly, so the main reception country, destination country for Syrian refugees are Middle Eastern countries. So the Middle East is now the region that hosts more than 40% of all the world's refugees. If you count on top of that the Palestinian refugees, the Middle East is the place where 65% of the world's refugees are sheltered. So it's really the Middle East, you know, when we talk in Europe, I will go back to that we are facing this big influx of refugees. Of course, the Middle East is on the first, directly on the first. You see that. So Syrian refugees are mostly to be found, as I said, in the neighboring country, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, and within these countries in the borderlands regions. Although now Istanbul shelters something like 300,000, 350,000, 100,000 Syrians. So Syrians have also started to move within Turkey, but it's mostly in the borderlands that they are to be found. So there are very different situations regarding that can be found in the three main countries of destination in terms of condition of accommodation, of being sheltered. So I'm going to go back to the different countries. But mostly the Syrian refugees share same issues as to access to work, which is of course extremely important, especially when the conflict lasts and lasts and lasts, and that people do not have prospect to go back to Syria. So people have or have not resources, savings, but they have exhausted their savings after a few years or even a few months of conflict. So access to work is a key issue, and in all neighboring countries, access to work is extremely restricted. There are some movements in Turkey currently, but so this is a big issue. Issue of accommodation, and one of the main issue is also an issue of education. For the children and for the young adults that were enrolled, because Syria had a very high level of schooling, and nearly all the children were enrolled in schools, and Syria had also a high level of young people who were attending universities and different types of trainings. So the issue of education is not only limited to the small children. So just to have a quick overview in the three different countries. So in Lebanon, there are no camps, no formal camps. People live mainly into either private accommodation, so people rent on sometimes very difficult conditions in the private market. Collective shelters have also been organized in schools, etc., in former warehouses to shelter people. And so as formal camps are not wanted by the Lebanese government, who has a history of camps with the Palestinians, actually informal camps are taking place, especially in the Bekaa Valley, which is in the middle of Syria, which is one of the poorest region of Lebanon already, with already a lack of infrastructures, including schools, and this is where most of those informal camps that you can see on this picture are taking place. So the project that is supported by both, the Sambola project, is a Syrian-run education project that serves actually those communities of Syrian children who live in those areas. So in Lebanon, there is little assistance for Syrian refugees, little protection. And there is a high level of children who do not attend school as a consequence of lack of infrastructure to welcome them. And there is a lot of, from teenagehood, a lot of children, and especially male children, who are dropping off school and go to work, basically. But there are very active local and national NGOs who are trying to provide social welfare, educational program, etc. support. In Jordan, the Syrian refugees population make up 10% of the Jordanian population. So in Lebanon, there are 1.5 minimum refugees in the country, which means on a population of 4 million inhabitants in Lebanon, you see the scale of the difficulties that is also faced by the country to welcome everyone. Difficulties for Syrians regarding access to work, and also difficulties for Syrians to join education. There are a few camps, but actually less than 15% of the Syrian refugees are sheltered in those camps that are mainly at the border. You've heard of those Zaatari camp, which is a massive camp that has been established by the UN at the border. But most of the people are renting on the private market in the Jordanian cities. In Turkey, very briefly, so there are what has been called 5 stars camps that have been established in the borderland area, but most of the people here again are getting shelter on the private market, or also on getting accommodation in very direct condition in unfinished buildings, etc. There has been an open door policy until recently, but as you know, Turkey is now raising difficulties in welcoming welcoming the Syrians. So there are. I'm trying to wrap it up because I see the time running. The same difficulties that are to be found in other countries for the Syrians are to be found in Turkey as well, which is, how to remain when there are restrictions on access to work. The education provisions are met, but only to a certain extent. There is also the issue of language in Turkey, which is problematic because children cannot join the Turkish education system, so another education system has to be put in place. Just to finish on the European aspect of the human cost of the Syrian crisis. So since last summer, the arrival of Syrians have very understandably been at the forefront of the newspapers. Actually, the flow of Syrian refugees coming to Europe had started already during the previous year, but last year we have experienced important flow. So there is an issue of perception because with this idea that Europe is facing a massive flow. Actually, it's the merger. What we see is the merger of several different flows. There are at least 2 main pathways to Europe. One from the central Mediterranean, where it's more flows that are coming from Africa. And there is a main pathway from Turkey going to Europe, but there are several nationalities that are merging, so it's not one flow, it's different flows that are merging together. It's mostly the Syrians are the more important group of those refugee flows trying to go to Europe. But what is to be seen in the current flows is that there are different types of flows, including of Syrian refugees. So there are refugees that are fleeing conflict and persecution directly. And last summer there has been a lot of fighting in north of Syria with the Islamic group, among other things, that have also prompted people to leave. Now, as you know, there are the Russian bombings in the Aleppo area, and so people are trying to cross the border to Turkey and maybe to join Europe. But what is very clear in interviewing the Syrians who try to join Europe is that it's mostly Syrians who have already been displaced internally, then in the neighboring region, and faced by all the difficulties that I have briefly described, can't see their future. They see that the Syrian conflict is nowhere to be ended soon, and so they try to go somewhere else to build a new living and to have more prospects. So there has been a succession of movement, people who first went to Europe and who are now more and more, we see in the flows that it's children and women who are joining the flows towards Europe. So it's kind of family reunion. So we are on a second or third moment of the dynamic of refugee movement towards Europe. So there is this feeling in Europe, in some of some part of the European population, that there is a European crisis, that we are in a moment of crisis, and that the refugee crisis is a European crisis, that EU can't cope, that the foundation of the EU are sort of jeopardized also. So we just have to remind ourselves that the situation after the First World War and the Second World War was actually worse. There were 4.5 million of refugees that came from Soviet Union to Germany, from the eastern part of Europe to Germany after the Second World War. That we have faced, as you know, the large movement of refugees during the Yugoslavian wars at the beginning of the 90s. There were 800,000 people from former Yugoslavia that came to Europe and especially to Germany. And actually, although the numbers are not extremely precise, the refugee flows represent 0.2% of the EU population. So what we can ask ourselves is what is actually the cause of this perception of the crisis? Is this flux of refugees an external factor that jeopardizes the EU, or is it also the fact that the politics of the EU member states are extremely unprepared and unable to get together to cope with this situation?
Thank you very much. I feel very honoured to be sharing a platform with Leila. In fact, rather a fraud, because my self-knowledge of Syria is really based on 1 week there. In November, I was part of a very small delegation organised by Mairead Maguire, joint Nobel Prize winner for her work in Northern Ireland. We were able to visit Damascus and up to Homs twice, to Tartus, and then to down in the south, where you have Christian villages surrounded by the Al-Nusra front. It's a very limited experience. And one of the people I went with was an interesting Anglican priest called Andrew Ashdown, who's been to Syria many times. And I had the fascinating experience a couple of days ago of listening to him engage with Leila. Both experts in different ways, both with a profound commitment. And also you could see how much they disagreed with each other, which just shows the complexity of it. I was reminded of the rabbi who was approached by two farmers who disagreed over a question, and he listened to one farmer, And at the end he said, yes, you're right. And then he listened to the other farmer. He said, yes, you're right. And then his wife came to him and said, you can't agree with both of them. And she said, yes, you're right too. So I'll only just make 3 very, very brief points since time's passing. First of all, I was struck by the extraordinary complexity of the situation. If you look, there is a cessation of hostilities, you know, at the moment, but there are over 97 opposition parties. And trying to find our way forward, I think, is extraordinarily difficult. And I'm sure Leila would agree that the first priority is to listen to Syrians. Syrians inside and Syrians outside. Andrew said in his report, perhaps my biggest lesson in these past 6 weeks is just how complex and multi-layered the situation is. It's not nearly as clear-cut as the media and politicians are making out. And Western policies, actions and alliances are without doubt making it infinitely worse. The second thing, I was really struck by my visit in Syria in November, in Baghdad and Kurdistan a year ago, and in Algeria on various occasions, by the atmosphere of violence, raw, naked violence. Our base in the trip to Syria was halfway between Damascus and Homs, 3 miles usually from the front line with ISIS. Every night you heard the artillery, the gunfire, you felt yourself surrounded by violence. When we went to Malula, a Christian village in the south, we were just getting involved in the visit when we were hustled into cars. We had to get out immediately because al-Nusra Front had noticed we were there and were planning an attack. But I'm increasingly convinced that although obviously we have to have some strategy to defeat ISIS, but we will ultimately only win if we address the conflict, the violence which is part of our own culture. I was stuck in an airport hotel in Boston just over a week ago, and I flicked among the 500 possible American channels. Most of them were devoted to violence, to killing, to explosions. I have to confess that a chunk of the community, we all went to see Spectre together. Wonderfully intelligent, clever film, but most of it violent. The best bit was at the end when James Bond threw away his pistol. The American Academy of Pediatricians has asserted that by the age of 18, most American teenagers will have witnessed 200,000 acts of violence in the media and some 16,000 murders, most of these treated as glamorous or humorous. Our culture in the West is in love with guns. I think if you want to see a beautiful exploration of this, read the latest Man Booker Prize novel by Marlon James, A Brief History of 7 Killings. It is the most extraordinary exploration of our love affair with murder. And not just the violence of guns, the violence of our language. If you look at the language of politicians, so much of it is violent, abusive, dismissive, contemptuous, and it saturates our media. So we will never defeat ISIS, I think, until we actually become people who are profoundly peaceful. And that is an enormous challenge for us as a culture. Final remark, I was struck everywhere I went, in the Middle East and in the Maghreb, by the enduring affection between so many Muslims and Christians. When you read our media, you get the impression it is just utter hostility. So let me leave you with just 3 images. First from Algeria. going to the tomb of our Dominican Bishop Pierre Claverie, Bishop of Oran, who was murdered in 1996. You go to his tomb these days and you will find it covered with flowers. Most of these are left by Muslims who come in pilgrimage to his tomb. Or I think of Iraq, Baghdad, where I was a year ago. I remember a lovely evening in a Muslim restaurant in the very heart of Baghdad, where they served impregnating chicken, sheet full of rice, and upside down chicken, which was particularly juicy. And to see there the welcome that we got, the image of the Last Supper on the wall of the restaurant, an icon of Our Lady with candles in front of it, I think is to see some sign of hope in, despite it all, the great affection and love which continues between so many Muslims and Christians. And finally in Syria, in November, the village just below the monastery where we were based, Kara, was taken over by ISIS and virtually destroyed. The churches were utterly ruined. They tried to burn them down. They dug up the graves, destroyed the icons. And when we were able to go back, the Muslims said, where would you celebrate Christmas? Come and celebrate it in the mosque. And in response, Christians made the offer, accepted that the Muslims were welcome to come and celebrate the birth of Muhammad in the church. So there are little signs of hope, I think, in those enduring affections. Thank you.